All right, we have been tracing the story, the big story of the Bible. We have our timeline we've been following along. We started with creation. We've been hitting the main characters, Abraham and Moses and David. And now we're sort of at this sort of period. We've gone most of the way through the Old Testament. And we come up to this where we've heard this promise given to this wandering nomad. We had that long time of being sojourns, being slaves in Egypt, and then coming into the promised land and the sort of the conquest of that, and then things have finally now settled in with kings. This monarchy under King David. If you remember, God had warned the people that having a monarch was not a good idea, and we've seen again and again. When absolute power is given, it corrupts. And so the story of the kings is simply a story of coups and rebellions and murders as they struggle for power and for wealth. It's not a pretty picture as we read it. The idea that God had was that the leader, the king, should be a shepherd. That's why he chose David, right? The shepherd, someone should understand it's not about protecting yourself, it's about protecting your flock. But we see again and again, the seductiveness of power and wealth proves to be too much for those who are put in those positions. So David ruled for 40 years. We left off last year with David. And let me just give a little bit of David's family tree here. It gets a little complicated. And as it goes on, it gets more and more dysfunctional, all right? David had 18 sons, 8 wives that we know by name, a bunch of concubines. Trouble is, the oldest kids all killed each other. And so it was a difficult time to figure out who's going to take the throne when David is gone. There was one of the sons, his name was Adonijah, who thought he should be king. He was sort of next in line, but he didn't really want to wait for David to die before he started. So he calls in his other brothers, calls in the generals, calls in the officials, and says, don't you guys think I should be king? And why should we wait till David dies? Why don't we just go ahead and start doing this now? Well, that doesn't go over real well with David. He wanted his favorite son, Solomon. Even though he was way down the line, he thought Solomon should get the throne. So he quickly gets a priest and anoints Solomon while the party's going on in the other room with his other son. Well, Adonijah knows this means trouble. And so if his brother, who he didn't invite to the party, just was made king, he was going to be in hot water. So he runs to the temple and claims sanctuary. Now, one of the things you could do, it's part of what we talk about, a sanctuary being a place. He goes, he places his hands on the altars and pleads for sanctuary. And Solomon says, all right, I promise not to kill you, until Solomon changed his mind and killed him anyway. But anyway, that's sort of how things go in this story. So we want to go to David on his deathbed then, calls Solomon in and gives him final instructions. He says, be strong, be courageous, keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways, keeping his statutes and his commandments, his ordinances, and his testimony, as it is written in the law of Moses, so you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. It's beautiful. I wish he would have stopped right there. I mean, that would have been great if he just would have said that and then died. But he doesn't. He goes on. He gives Solomon a hit list of all his enemies he wants him to execute. All right? It just really takes away from the first part. If he just would have stopped there, it would have been great. And Solomon follows the worst of his father's example, right? He rules by fear and intimidation. He implements forced labor, puts massive taxes. He has these lavish building projects. I mean, he builds a absolutely beautiful temple for God, but then he makes a palace for himself twice as big as the temple to God he makes for himself. He has gold-plated eating utensils, gold-plated everything. And how did he pay for all this lavishness? Time-honored tradition, tax the poor, right? So the rich can live in luxury. And the people are just languishing under this burden for him to be able to live that way. Solomon takes, remember David had 8 wives, Solomon has 700 wives, all right? 300 concubines. Many of them were foreigners. Part of what Solomon did was make treaties with people, and by sealing treaties oftentimes would be marrying someone's daughter to do that. But in order to keep these foreign wives happy, Solomon builds temples to their gods so that they can worship their gods there in Israel. And things start going downhill. Solomon had been given this gift of wisdom, and earlier on showed great wisdom. But fortunately, he does not continue to use that gift. By the end of his reign, the kingdom is on the verge of collapse. So something has to change. So God raises up a prophet. His name is Ahijah, to choose a new ruler. Just like a generation or two before that, Samuel had gone to choose David. He knew that Saul's family was corrupt. They had to get someone outside the system. So likewise here, we know that Solomon's kids are just as bad as Solomon. They need someone else to come in and be king. So they find this brave, courageous man named Jeroboam. And God tells him, look, I promised that David would have a descendant on the throne, so we're going to give him a little bit. We're going to give him 2 of the tribes, but I'm going to give the other 10 tribes to you. And so when Jeroboam hears this, he immediately flees to Egypt and hides because he knows when word gets out about this, Solomon's son is not going to be happy about this as well. So anyway, Solomon dies and his son Rehoboam comes to power. And when Jeroboam hears this, that Solomon has died now, then Jeroboam comes back and says, well, let's see what's going to happen here now. I mean, the prophet of God said, I get to have the north, and Rehoboam will be stuck with the south. But how's this going to work? So they all gather around Rehoboam. Let's pick up our reading here. So Rehoboam went to Shechem, and all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And all the assembly of Israel had come. When we talk about Israel, we're talking about the northern kingdom. So Israel came as well, and said to Rehoboam, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and the heavy yoke he placed on us, and we will serve you. He said to them, go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Then King Rehoboam took counsel with the older men who attended his father Solomon while he was still alive, saying, how would you advise me to answer these people? They answered him, if you will be a servant to these people today, if you will serve them, speak good words to them when you answer them, they will be your servants forever. But he disregarded the advice the older men gave him. He consulted with the younger men who had grown up with him and now attended him. He said to them, what do you advise me to answer this people who have said to me, lighten the yoke your father has put on us? And here I need to edit this a little bit because it quickly degenerates into locker room talk about how size matters, and they're not talking about brains. It's all in euphemisms, but his buddies just are no help to Rehoboam whatsoever. But Rehoboam takes the advice of his buddies, not the older advisors. And so he calls the people back, and Rehoboam says this. He says, my father made your yoke heavy, but I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined you with whips. I'll discipline you with scorpions. Now, when Israel saw that the king would not listen to them, they answered the king, what share do we have with David? We have no inheritance with the son of Jesse. To your tents, Israel. Now look to your own house, David. So what ends up being the northern tribes secede. They say, okay, we don't need you as our king. And so they take Jeroboam, and said Jeroboam was willing and says, you can be our king. So they anoint Jeroboam to be king of the northern 10 tribes, which we call Israel. Rehoboam is left with Judah, the southern 2 tribes. And the prophecy of Ahijah is fulfilled. Unfortunately, the very first thing Jeroboam does is he worries about, how do I consolidate power? He's afraid if the people go down to Jerusalem, which is down in Judah, that they might nurture sympathies for the south. So he creates his own worship areas up in the north, complete with golden calves to worship, right? And takes Israel down a dark path from which they will never return. There are no heroes in our story today, all right? So why am I telling you, this sad story of no heroes? It's not one of the stories I remember even hearing about in Sunday school. But we can learn something, even from bad examples, right? What not to do, if you will. History doesn't have to repeat itself, but way too often it does. We talked a little bit last week, too, about the American experience. In some ways, there are some parallels here. I mean, they had, as a fledgling country, we were trying to figure out, we no longer wanted to be under the rule of a monarch who had complete supreme power over us. We said, we want to have a voice in what we do. There's a dangers when the wealth and power are held by a very few. And so we created a constitution. We said there needs to be a separation of powers. There needs to be accountability, so those who are entrusted with their power don't abuse it, that they see themselves as servants of the people, not lords over the people. It's interesting when we use this, it's even as a church, we use monarchy language to talk about God, even though it's something that we defined our country by opposing ourselves to monarchy. Yet in the church all the time we talk about the kingdom of God, we talk about God as king. But Jesus helps us redefine what that means. Not king the way that everyone else thinks about a king, right? Back to the gospel reading that Carol read for us. He defines what leadership really looks like. Let me just read part of that again. He says among the Gentiles, they recognize their rulers and they lord it over them. They're great tyrants over them. But he says, not to be like this with you. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, to give his life as a ransom for many. The example of Jesus is that of a servant leader, someone who leads not by creating fear, but by sacrifice, humility, compassion, love. As an example to follow for us, whether it's on the playground or the workplace, in our families or the halls of government. Those who would lead are those who serve. We pause today to remember another event. Thousands of years after David, we had this event which we call Reformation, right? In many ways, things had not changed over several thousand years, right? They were still monarchs who were abusing their power, but history was changing. All of a sudden, there was a new wind blowing, and people were saying, "Is this the way that it has to be?" But the church was not exempt from this movement as well, right? That they had grown from this simple group of followers from Jesus to this massive institution that wrangled, again, for wealth and power. It even had its own armies. It would invade. It would do things like that. Somehow the church had forgotten as well that leaders were supposed to be servants, that peasants were not just sources of revenue for building projects, which was happening. I mean, at Luther's time, that's what sort of pushed him over the edge, right? They wanted to build new St. Peter's Cathedral, so the church began selling forgiveness of sins in order to finance the building project. Well, Luther comes and he has discovered the power of the Word of God, and he challenges the powers of the church, saying there's a higher power, the Scriptures, the word of grace, that forgiveness is something that is absolutely free. It's been paid for by the cross of Christ. We can't charge someone for that. And sparks this movement that we call then the Reformation. It reshapes history in many ways. Puts the Scriptures into the hands of people, gives rise to this tradition that we call now being Lutheran. I want to share with you a song. It comes from a rock opera, which is simply called Luther. It was written by one of my favorite bands, Lost and Found. They're they are the absolute most creative Lutheran songwriters that I know, hands down. There's no one comes close to them. And so a couple years ago, in honor of the 500th anniversary, they wrote this rock opera called Luther. I went to see it last year, went to it, and I'm going to play just one of the songs from it that I really love. It's about Luther wrestling with understanding who God is. He had grown up being afraid of God, thought that God was just there waiting for him to mess up so he could punish him. And he had to spend his whole life just trying to be good enough or for God to be able to love him. When Luther discovers grace, a God who loves him, it changes everything. And that really fuels Reformation. The song is simply called, "What Kind of God?"
What kind of God would you be if you did not want souls to be free? If you demanded our bribes for saving our hides, what kind of God would you be? What kind of God would we praise if a child were deemed damned on the first of her days? Do we bow and adore just to settle some score? What kind of God do we praise? Are you expecting our wealth in exchange for good health? And what kind of God must save souls from himself? What kind of God would that be? No, the word has been clear. God is not angry or a monster to fear. The work has been done. Salvation is won. God is holding us near. This is all by God's grace. Jesus has saved us a place. By faith in the work of Christ on the tree, an empty tomb, a heavenly key, God's everlasting embrace. Nothing can separate us now. It's not by our work or the sweat of our brow, not for us to decide to add to our pride. This is God's own vow. That's the God that you are, creating, redeeming, honest, Clark, loving, leading, ransoming people, not stealing their funds for building a steeple, but with us, for us, closer than far. That's the God that you are, our advocate, Savior, Ancient of Days. That's the God that we praise, revealed in Christ, stripe and scar. That's the God that you are, with us, for us, closer than far. That's the God that you are. That's the God that you are.
The images are from a graphic novel, comic book that they also produced last year. We got a copy of it in our library. If you haven't looked at it, just a fun way of rediscovering the story again. Luther's intention was not to split the church, but to reform it. Unfortunately, that was a little too much change too fast and plunged Europe into years of conflict over religion. But over the centuries, we've come back from that animosity and found in many ways Catholics and Protestants are more alike than they are different. We're going to sing a song now. It was written by a young Catholic, Roman Catholic. His name is David Haas. He's from Minnesota, Twin Cities, I think. He had a gift like Luther had a gift of being able to put things to music, and has a deep love for the church, ability to express himself in songs. Like Luther, it was important that people are able to sing songs that proclaim the gospel, and they should be songs that are singable. Luther went on to write, I don't know how many hymns, scores of them. This is one that David wrote, We Are Called. Let's rise as we sing.